how the division, what the division believes and how we're going to continue to practice what we practice. So, and you are actually at hot off the presses. We have our new mission statement that's put together that we'll hopefully be putting out regarding partnering with families and communities, and to be able to provide those resources and supports that lead to really independence for families in terms of safety and health for them. So DCYF has, as a part of that practice model, some foundational strategies and evidence-based practices that we have been implementing and exploring throughout the agency to be able to use these practices to engage families in better health and, again, those outcomes that we talked about. We are a trauma-informed agency, and we've been working with Dartmouth College in terms of being able to implement practices around trauma-informed work, screenings for families around trauma that may have happened in their lives, and referring and training clinicians and practitioners around trauma-informed practices, cognitive behavioral therapeutic, I'm never going to say this right, TSCBT. So those trauma-informed practices. Also, we've been engaged with the University of Louisville around solution-based casework. Dana Christensen, if anyone knows his work, around how to positively engage with families in doing things that help them be healthy for themselves. More recently, restorative practices is being implemented throughout the division, starting most recently with our Sununu Youth Services Center and engagement around restoring the harm, or repairing the harm for kids and families around things that may have happened from certainly crimes from youth. Those practices are actually being, movement is being made towards putting that in juvenile probation and parole and child protection services. That's actually more at its infancy stage than the other two practices. To also give you an idea of all the things that are happening, these really tie to those practices around what we're doing. So as you see, a couple of them, it's for all the practices. We're talking about outcomes. We're talking about safety and partnerships. Whoops, let me back up. And the partnership piece certainly is key with involving you folks as well. We're looking at, again, a holistic approach. That's practical, that families don't see, well, as we all know, huge acronym lists about the things that we do with them and involve them in agencies that have long lines of, well, as I said it before, TFCBT or trauma-informed or SPC, as we call solution-based casework. Families don't, as you know, partner with us real well if that's all we're talking. So again, going back to the practical kinds of languages and engagement strategies, using evidence-based practices, thinking about permanency and well-being and safety for these families. So as we move forward, we're talking, and in this presentation, as part of the things that we talk about in our practice model, there's a beginning sort of for child protection in terms of where do we start. So who is a mandated reporter to DCYF? Now there's this big long spiel here about what the law says a reporter needs to be in terms of being required to report. At the end of it, though, you'll notice, and in bold, it says, or any other person. There's a whole list of professionals, but at the bottom, really, the long and the short of it is, anyone really in New Hampshire is mandated to report. So if you suspect, you are the one who is mandated to report. And I think people probably already know that. So the nature and content of that report, certainly the conversation is around what kinds of things do you need to call central intake about? And we do have a centralized intake. And the law specifically says that an oral report shall be made immediately by telephone or otherwise, and followed within 48 hours by a report in writing, if so requested, to the department. Generally speaking, when folks make a report to DCYF, we are not open 24 hours a day. So immediately takes on a new meeting in terms of being able to report when you know something. Hours currently are 8 to 4:30. With some of the legislative changes currently, DCYF is moving towards a 24-hour response. It is not up and running as of yet. We are standing up a working team of professionals, child protection workers, that will be working 12 to 8 shifts in each of the district offices, but also know that that is one person for each area from the 12 to 8 shifts. So it's very small and really emergency-based in terms of the response to that. There is also the requirement that we're going to be fulfilling around standing up a 24-hour intake response. And again, that's not happening as of today, but the plans are in the works to have that hopefully happening soon. But again, content and nature of the report immediately talks about and followed up in writing, and the writing piece is very important for staff and child protection work. When you are making a report, anyone, and here it says, anyone participating in good faith of making the report pursuant to this chapter is immune from liability. So if you believe that you are making that report in good faith, then you are immune from being sued or prosecuted. Now, in terms of confidentiality, so we have caveats that we usually talk to folks about around it being confidential. If you are a professional, we really appreciate having your name be used with the professionals that you are making the report to, and kept confidential from the family. If that's okay with you, you can do that. I would put a caveat to that by saying, if you know this information and you are the only one that knows this information, family certainly can go in depth and talk with you further about, I know it was you that reported. It's up to you in terms of how you want to gauge that response. If you're already working with a family and they kind of have an idea that things might not be going as well as they thought it might be, and you know that you need to make a report, you can certainly have the conversation about your mandate around having to report. But again, that's a comfort level and certainly something up to you to decide in conjunction with your agencies, but also around what you can and can't say with families based on your comfort level and, again, your agency's protocols. I would also suggest that maybe having a proactive conversation about how that happens in terms of what your policies are to make it easier for families, I guess, if you will, in terms of listening to what you have to say and what you are mandated to do. So the suggestion might be a little proactive approach. So when you're deciding to report, anytime you suspect, there's no mandate about you need to prove that there's abuse or neglect. You are only mandated to report it if you suspect. And some questions that we thought that you might want to keep in mind, or sort of thought-provoking kinds of questions for you with your agencies, thinking about what your agency's protocols are. What do you have to do in terms of your agency around reporting? And how do they line up with making that report immediately with what the law says? And then thinking about that ahead of time, what are your next steps in terms of making sure that you're kind of aligned with what the law is and what your agency's protocols are? Do they match up? Do they make sense? And oftentimes what we'll do is if you have questions or things that you just want to run by intake, you can certainly do that anytime, certainly at 8 to 4:30 right now. And just say, I have this scenario that I'm not sure what to do with. And they're always very appreciative of having those conversations ahead of time. So in terms of information to give to central intake when you call, who and what? So we always talk about those 5 questions whenever we're asking things of families or of ourselves, the who, what, when, where, and why kinds of questions. In terms of central intake, that's no different. Starting with the who, really anyone that you know about that's part of that household that we should have information about or contact information about. So the children, the siblings, parents, bio, staff, guardians, relatives that are in the home, anyone responsible for caring for those kids, if you think we should know about them and you have contact information for them, that's the kind of information that we would need. And certainly any other household members that might be a part of that family or that household. What kinds of things? Now, I talked about this. Names, if you have their names, their nicknames, or any other kind of name associated with them, so aliases or other things that we might know these families by, that's always helpful. Dates of birth, certainly if you have them, and literally when I say everybody, I mean everybody. Addresses. Now, phone numbers in this wave of technology, I think home phones are kind of going by the wayside a little bit, but certainly if you have that information, and then work phones, and specifically certainly cell phones, since that seems to be the way the world these days. In terms of basic content for those reports, how did you learn about the information? Where did you hear it from? Did you see it? And any details around that. And this says the relationship of the perpetrator. We're talking about the person that's responsible for the maltreatment. Who is present, if anyone has seen anything, any other folks that we should talk to. Dates and times of things, so we're looking at frequency here, and if you have specifics around that frequency, that's very helpful. And then the method of harm, certainly, if it's abuse, neglect, and what kind of abuse or neglect. And when I say frequency and severity, certainly that goes back to the dates and times part of it, but it also talks about the severity piece I'm asking for. So when you think about bruises, how often, how many, in response to what, are there triggers for that kind of thing. And then the risk factors, sort of the big three, and certainly what's happening currently around substance abuse, domestic violence, and mental or physical impairments. And those mental or physical impairments could be with anyone in that home. Children, adults, and the same goes for the other two. And really, literally, any other information that you think is important for child protection staff to know, such as how do you engage with this family? What's the best way to talk to them? And what will set them off the least, if you will, around our contact with them? Can you help buffer that? Can you help allow a CPSW to get in contact with the family? Can you help, segue that? So, and then since you're all working with families, when you're talking with children, since you're already talking with them as part of your engagement with them, we're not asking you to formally interview a child, but it is recommended certainly that you clarify some things with them. And so some overarching open-ended questions that you may ask already, but certainly are good to get information about what happened next, who did that, and when did that happen. Certainly are key kinds of questions. So now I'm going to talk about the types of abuse and neglect, which I'm hoping that folks have an idea about already, but certainly if we have questions along the way, definitely ask. We're talking about physical abuse. And when we say physical abuse, it's that piece around something that's happened by other than accidental means and an injury has occurred. So something not accidental, but certainly something that has happened. And you don't have to have medically significant injuries if you believe there is a threat of harm to that child, but certainly they're going to want specific details around that. Some indicators. Now I have 2 slides of indicators, and I want you to pay attention to those in terms of the rest of the talk around indicators because they tend to flow with the other sets of abuse and neglect as well. They can cross over. So extensive bruising, that's fairly obvious if you see something like that. Most folks, if you're observing those kinds of things, will question. Burns of any type, certainly cigarette burns, glove-like or immersion burns are those, when you talk about glove-like on a hand, you can certainly see things. For example, when a hand is closed, you may, and a person opens it, you'll see the skin looking normal in between the fingers, and then the redness coming around the whole hand. And that's certainly true of immersion. It's certainly true of an immersion burn. Bruises on multiple body parts or in the shape of an object. Certainly you can see different things. If you're seeing a child regularly, you may see a change from one visit to the next around either the object shape itself from the body part and the increase in maybe swelling or the bruise itself, but also bruises on multiple parts of the body, maybe of the same shape, maybe not. And certainly if a child complains of soreness or awkward movement and frequent injury or in pain, and sometimes kids will favor a side or one side or another of their body. Ulcers, stomach aches and headaches, frequent conversation about that or talking about it. And then you're talking about sleep problems, appetite disturbances, stomach aches, and headaches again. Some more indicators for folks. I think these folks already know these terms, but enuresis or encopresis, wetting and soiling of themselves, and compulsive and repetitive acts for self-soothing and control, and sort of a fixation on a security item, oftentimes beyond age appropriateness. Then you're talking about social withdrawal, so they don't want to be in contact with anybody. They've withdrawn completely. There's certainly aggressive acting out, and I don't need to read the slides for you to basically know that that can happen with animals and other folks. Anxiety and nightmares. Kids get scared at odd times or strange happenings. Some folks have phobias and obsessions, sometimes pica, when kids want to eat things such as paper. Depression or guilt, an impaired capacity to enjoy life. Those are the kids sometimes hand in hand going with that withdrawal piece that we talked about. So sexual abuse is a really all-encompassing kind of definition in the law. It's really talking about not only the acts themselves, but the simulation of those acts and the exploitation of those acts. And the biggest part around that law is really around the secrecy and the coercion pieces of it that will play themselves out that folks would tend to see. If we're talking about indicators of sexual abuse, so we talked a little bit about this in the physical abuse category around behavioral indicators, sudden changes, withdrawals, repetitive kinds of things. So keeping in mind some of these things for sexual abuse, a little bit more in terms of detail. Young children performing sexually explicit acts upon one another, and knowing in our society around how much kids know nowadays anyway about sex, that has certainly made, I guess I would say, figuring out whether things are beyond their age or not. So the sexualized behaviors and or language above and beyond normal expected developmental stages has changed over the years because kids know more about sex. They're exposed to it more. You see things more on daytime TV now than you ever saw, even at night, say 15 years ago. So it's not abnormal necessarily for younger kids to explore one another sexually, to perform acts on one another sometimes, because they may have seen it or may have known it from television, from iPads, all kinds of other electronic media that they're seeing these things on. In terms of excessive masturbation, certainly that's above and beyond, well, again, thinking about it, above and beyond normal behavior. And then force, coercion, and secrecy, sort of the big three in terms of thinking about sexual abuse for kids. They know about secrecy and coercion at sometimes a very young age. And then the force piece you might learn about if someone discloses something to you. Or you may see an injury. Further indicators of sexual abuse, and these are the physical indicators that we talked about earlier, but some difficulty in walking or sitting, so it could be physical, could be sexual. Torn, stained, or bloody underclothing, which I would say more often than not you will not see, but that is an indicator. Pain, itching, or swelling in that genital area, and when urinating. And then bruises or bleeding to the external genitalia, vaginal or anal areas, mouth or throat, which you generally will not see, but certainly could be present. And then sometimes vaginal discharge, which can happen normally, but abnormally could be an indicator of sexual abuse. And venereal disease or vaginal infections can certainly be indicators as well, but not solely a telltale sign of sexual abuse, since we know that sometimes children can get diseases just from birth. Neglect. Now, neglect tends to be our all-encompassing type of maltreatment. So we have some conditions around when neglect occurs. Children certainly have been abandoned, and we tend to use without proper parental care or control as the catch-all for a lot of things. Also, whose parents or guardians are not able to have somebody care for their kids in the case that they're incarcerated or hospitalized or some other incapacity, is all included in neglect. So some conditions under neglect, and we can talk about those a little bit. There's abandonment, parental incapacity, educational neglect, failure to protect, lack of supervision, medical or dental neglect, and inadequate basic care. And generally when we talk about neglect conditions, the conversation is more about the severity of the neglect and the harm to the child around certain conditions. And ruling out sort of cultural kinds of pieces in families and marginal parenting, I guess, if you will. So, and that tends to come up in terms of medical or dental neglect a lot of times and lack of supervision. So in terms of, for example, medical or dental neglect, a child having a cavity isn't necessarily dental neglect. When it comes to the point of abscess and the child's health might suffer, that could be considered neglect. And with all of these, it's really a depends kind of conversation. What generally will happen is if you're calling something in and speaking to the intake worker, they're really going to want the detail around what the harm is to the child because of these conditions and what kinds of things, for example, might have been tried or spoken to with the parents about it and where things are at. And if there hasn't been a conversation, certainly that's fine too, but if you do have information, they're going to want the detail about it. So the other thing that comes up with neglect sometimes in terms of, for example, inadequate basic care, macaroni and cheese is a food item, and if children, that's all they're eating, they're being fed. So in terms of severity, it may not be all the food groups, but a child is getting fed. If we're also talking about, for example, medical neglect, what often comes up during those conversations is around the head lice issue. Head lice on its own is not neglect. Children who go to school sometimes have head lice for days and sometimes recurring episodes of it, depending on how it's gone through school and depending on the treatment pieces for kids. Parents who treat their children sometimes get frustrated when they go back to school and get it back again, and kids come home with it again. The issue becomes neglectful certainly when there is injury to a child, and you have to talk about harm again. What is the harm to this child because of this head lice? Is it ferreted into their skull in such a way that there are sores, that it's a detriment to their health? And we know that despite any interventions, that children are still suffering because of that. And again, we need to know what the suffering piece means. So there will be questions. Further details will be asked about those kinds of things. And I guess I would just say, remembering when you're making a report, needing to know what the harm is and how it's affecting the child. So we are actually halfway, and I just want to check in to see if there are any questions or if there are things that I can answer at this point. Okay. All right, well, we'll keep going then. So I was asked to provide some information around DCYF investigations, and hopefully this covers some of the questions that have been asked prior to me coming on board. But if not, certainly raise your hand. And actually, I see a question there. Do you see that?
This is Katie saying, feel free to type in questions.
Oh, thanks, Katie. All right, so if we're talking about DCYF investigations, we have certainly 3 goals, and our federal partners from the Administration for Children and Families actually review what our practice is around these goals: safety, permanency, and well-being. So we're looking at children's safety within the context of their homes, and then permanency for kids, making sure they're with a family. And certainly that's one of DCYF's beliefs as part of our practice model. We believe that children belong with family. Whether it's their own or an adopted family or relatives, we want them to be in a permanent arrangement We don't want DCYF to be the primary caregiver of these kids for the rest of their lives. And then the other piece that we're also looking at is their well-being. Are they healthy? Do they have medical care? Is their mental health being attended to?
Question.
Oh, great. There's a question.
She said you mentioned headlights. Can you speak more about that?
So someone had a question about bed bugs. And I guess I would go back to that same conversation. How are the bed bugs affecting a child? Is it causing harm to them in some way? And what is that harm? Is it because parents aren't cleaning the bed necessarily and taking care of those sheets and or taking care of the problem in that room or the house if it's further? Is it because they don't know how? And is it because any intervention that's provided for them, something's not happening? But again, going back to what is the harm to that child because of those bed bugs? Are they needing to be medically treated for sores or from bites from the bed bugs? And are those sores going untreated? So it kind of follows the path of harm to that child, and really with most of those things. Hopefully that answers your question. So getting back to investigation, again, we talked about the goals, again, safety, permanency, and well-being for our staff looking at those kinds of things. So if I back up just in terms of the path, and at the end of the presentation, there's a flow chart, and we'll kind of follow that a little bit. But if someone's making a report to central intake, and the conversation with that reporter is that, yes, we're going to take a look at that, it will then follow to a district office in terms of where the family lives, and assign to a social worker or a child protection worker to go out and engage with these families around these goals. Now, in terms of an assessment and investigation, the purpose for this child protection worker would be to determine, the bottom line is, determine whether maltreatment actually occurred. And in that process, they're going to be gathering information about what happened and figuring out how this child is going to be protected if there's a safety issue. Now, the other piece of that is, along the way, that information that's gathered has to be legally defensible in family court, district court, and criminal court. So everything that they're gathering has potential to go to court. And along with that, there is a huge process around collecting information, figuring out what happened, how it happened, and if there's anything else going on in this family in terms of maltreatment. Now, they're also going to be collaborating with law enforcement and prosecutors in court cases. So there's a parallel process between what DCYF does and what law enforcement does. Law enforcement is looking at whether there's a crime or not. That is not what DCYF does. DCYF is looking at safety. Are these kids safe where they are? And or can we make sure that they are? So in conjunction with families and having those conversations, how are you able to keep your kids safe? And how can we help that happen if it's not now? And then when I say initiate interventions to protect the child, that's exactly what we're talking about. Is it that this family doesn't know how to protect their kids? Is it that they don't know what could help them? And in that conversation, that's where you folks come in a lot of the time. You're the ones seeing them on a regular basis. And you are, by default, being there, in some ways, protecting those kids. Because you're having positive relationships with families on a regular basis and speaking to them about what's working for them, what's stressing them, and you may be the support for them to help that protection continue. So. Next, we'll talk about some of the components of an investigation. Sort of the biggest piece for child protection workers is engaging with families. And realistically, excuse me, this is on a very short-term basis if we're talking about investigations. We have 60 days to be in these people's lives. And generally speaking, in those 60 days, we're not seeing them every day, even every week, to have that happen. And around that engagement process is really respecting parental rights. And in New Hampshire, folks have tons of rights. They have the right to raise, parents have rights to raise their children exactly as they wish. And DCYF has an obligation not to hone in on those. The line for us is really where abuse and neglect occurs. So we do have to engage families and have those conversations. And the piece about what we're talking about in investigations is collaboration and partnership. And that isn't just with families. That's with community agencies that have a regular role in families' lives, and really checking on those kinds of relationships to see if they're going to be there to help support families without DCYF's involvement. Because ultimately, we don't want families to rely on DCYF to stay afloat or to continue to parent their children. We really want to be out of families' lives, and we want them to be independent and living safely on their own. So the other piece that we're talking about here is assuring that there's, in terms of an investigation, we want to make sure that everything that we're gathering for information is accurate and written down, and writing reports about, yes, we think this family is safe for this reason based on this investigation, or no, we don't, and we really need to go to court. And I know that sounds a little black and white. There's all kinds of continuum in between there. So really, again, it's surmising what's going to happen there out of everything that you gathered. And all through that process, you're safety planning with a family. You're having conversations with that family about how are you going to be able to keep your kids safe without us being involved? And if not, we need to talk about going to court. We need to talk to a judge about what isn't safe and what interventions we need to have happen to help make it safe. And it's up to a judge to decide whether there is abuse or neglect or not, and whether DCYF needs to be continued involved. It also, the decision is reliant on the court to make a decision about whether a child should be placed or not. DCYF does not have that decision-making power. So we put a slide together around activities that investigations happen in. And originally this slide was for the connection between law enforcement and child protection, so we kind of had an idea of what each other's roles were. I think it's pertinent here around sort of the pieces in terms of timeframes for staff. So child protection workers really have some timeframes to get some things to happen. And originally I said there's a 60-day time frame to complete an investigation. That hasn't changed. Having said that, though, we have a response time initially to get in contact with families. So in terms of connecting with a family, DCYF has a 72-hour response time in the law to commence an investigation. In DCYF policies, we actually look at sort of a triage process around having a face-to-face contact with families. So if, for example, this is a baby we're talking about and they're in harm's way, that might take priority over, say, a 15-year-old who has some independent physical abilities to get out of a situation. So we may respond to an infant before we respond to a 15-year-old. I noticed that there's two questions, so let me finish this thought and we'll look at the question. So, for example, in 24 hours, that might be the scenario where we would go out and see an infant. In those response times, we have 3 levels, and we call them level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1, again, I said that might be for the infant, and that is a 24-hour response time. Level 2 is a 48-hour, and level 3 is a 72-hour. And in that continuum would be the conversation around the severity of harm to a child and how immediate it might be in terms of our response. So I know we have some questions, so maybe we'll attend to those and I'll come back to the slide.
So first question from Mary Ann, do you use safety mapping as a tool?
So the question around from Mary Ann, thank you, was do you use safety mapping as a tool? Actually, no, DCYF doesn't use safety mapping as a practice necessarily, even though some folks in the agency know how to use it. We actually combined something, and I think that came out of Science of Safety. What happens for New Hampshire is we utilize a New Hampshire integrated assessment model, which has some components of Science of Safety, but combined with our CRC partners around structured decision-making, that evidence-based practice. New Hampshire actually put together this model to combine those kinds of things. So the conversation with staff and families is really around a holistic approach about how families keep kids safe. Hopefully that answers that question.
You have 2 more questions.
Oh, I have 2 more questions. Great.
The next question is from Heidi. She says, what support do workers provide to support families to prevent or early growth processes?
So Heidi asks the question of what supports does DCYF provide to families around support in the court process. So there's 2 pieces to that. And I'm not sure exactly the question, so I'm hoping I'll answer the 2 pieces that I think it is. In terms of the law, and there have been conversations about this, DCYF walks through the process of course with all families. They talk about what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and the process that they're actually walking them through is the civil process. In terms of the criminal court process, the DCYF doesn't have a specific role in the criminal process, but there are victim witness advocates assigned to cases to walk families through what will happen in a criminal court process. And so you probably know as home visitors that those processes sometimes go down very different paths and have different time frames. So support from both sides is critical. Oftentimes child protection workers in the ongoing case, if you will, sometimes see that crossover more than an investigation piece. And so for child protection workers in the investigation piece, the conversations are with families about, this is what it's going to look like. This is what's going to be asked of you. This is what's going to be said in court about sort of the timelines and what things have happened. The child protection worker will talk about everything that they've gathered in terms of information and what's going to be said to the judge. So I'm hoping that answers the question about support. Yeah.
Next question is from Melanie.
Okay.
How do you determine whether or not to investigate? Does the family have to already have a report filed through this investigation?
So Melanie's question was about how DCYF determines whether to investigate and if there is already a report that DCYF would investigate further if they had that as well. So in terms of determining whether we take the information in and do an investigation, I would say that that's a process around all of the components that we talked about originally in terms of the information that you give. So does it meet policy and law for us to go out? And really that depends kind of answer. If we're talking about harm and the safety pieces, the detail around that is really what's going to determine whether DCYF is going to become involved or not. When I talk specifically about the example, say with the macaroni and cheese part of it, if there's a question of malnourishment or a child is suffering in some way, we'd want to gather information from a variety of sources about that, or if you have specific information about their nutritional content. So how is the child's health suffering as a result, for example, of only eating macaroni and cheese? Are they deteriorating in some way? Is their physical being in danger in some way? So is their hair falling out and, for example, they're getting made fun of in school about that, and or teachers might know more information? Because sometimes what happens when folks call in is we get more than one report of something happening from a variety of sources. And just based on one person's perception of things from one agency may not be the whole picture of what's happening. We may have only pieces of it. If another agency calls and has the information that can be put together with that information, makes it enough for a DCYF worker to go out on, it may put the whole picture together around what the maltreatment really is and the severity of it. So when I say detail, that's the kind of piece that I'm thinking about when the determination is made for it to go to a district office. Hopefully that answers the question. Oh, we have another one.
So going back to Heidi's question, she's wondering more about preventing court and what the courts are in place.
So in terms of investigations, let me have the question again so people know what the question is.
About preventing court and what the courts are in place.
So the question is really around preventing court and what supports are in place. So in terms of court itself, that's the last thing that DCYF really wants to do. On a practical level, it's a whole lot more work, and it tends to alienate families and folks that are working with families, and it's not the first and foremost thing that DCYF really wants to do with families. We want to make sure, as I said before, that families can live independently on their own without us being involved. If we should become involved, the conversation really is, how can kids be safe in their own homes? And that's the conversation with parents. With some of the drug cases that are coming up currently, parents have a harder time keeping kids safe based on their own addiction issues. And so the conversation really is around that addiction. DCYF does have in some of the district offices, and hopefully soon all of the district offices, licensed drug and alcohol counselors that can come and talk to families about some of their addiction pieces and where they can go for assistance to help keep not only the kids safe, but themselves safe, and some support for them if they're wanting to be able to take advantage of that. Support prior to DCYF, I guess, closing a case, there are resource services in each of the catchment areas around prevention services, which we often refer folks to as a prevention method prior to going to court. And some families take advantage of that and some don't. We still refer folks for those supportive in-home kinds of services, and if families take advantage of those, sometimes that helps with the stress. Hopefully that helps. Well, we still have another question. One more. I'm not hitting it.
Because a large percent of reports do not go to court. What cases are resolved court that are found to be untrue or do not meet abuse?
So when we're talking about investigations, it central intake gets, well, actually I take that back. So let's go back to the question. We're looking to hear about founded, I guess, percentages in terms of how many cases are actually opened in DCYF and when DCYF gets involved further. Last year, central intake got about 25,000 calls. Yep, we'll get there. So last year, DCYF got about 25,000 calls. And what I would say is between the conversations with intake and the number of reports that went out, significantly less. That said, though, last year's reports were, I'm trying to think, I think there were about 3,000 reports sent across the state. Our numbers are up, our staff is down, so responding to those is really an in and out kind of conversation with families. So they're really just checking on safety. And what I would say in terms of our substantiation rate, realistically, we're opening about between 3 and 7% of all of the investigations that we take in. So doing the math in the opposite way, you've got about 90% that are referred for services or connected to services through the investigation process, or really just flat out unfounded in terms of conversation with families. And the end conversation with families is really about, you don't need us in our lives. You have all of these things in place. Your children are safe, and continue with this process, or come to these folks. They're going to be able to be the ones to help support you in this time. And so those are the things that DCYF generally has a conversation with families about at the end of their processes. And that's, as I talked about before, after doing all of that gathering of information, and we're looking to all those community resources. And sort of the standard resources that DCYF generally talks to are the schools, medical community, and law enforcement are kind of the three biggies. Although of late, any drug and alcohol sorts of counselors or folks that are willing to talk to us and or be referred to for families are the other big ones as well. Hopefully that answers the question this time. In terms of, so going back to our slide around investigative activities, all the things that I talked about in terms of gathering information. So we have record keeping and record sharing. DCYF has an obligation to keep records on families, and I would follow the similar path to what HIPAA talks about for medical communities around keeping things confidential. We gather all kinds of information. The law does allow us to share some records with law enforcement if we're doing a joint investigation on that particular family in that instance, because there are processes. For example, we don't want to be interviewing kids more than one time. And if we use the Child Advocacy Center to be able to interview a child, our information is shared that way. For collateral calls, as I call them, those are the three biggies that I talked about. We're talking about to the medical community, education community, certainly LADACs if they're available, and then law enforcement as well, just to find out the whole picture, again, about the family. And I talked to you already about responding in terms to an incident and commencing an investigation, and then the time frames for that piece. So the time frames, again, for DCYF is starting in terms of face-to-face seeing a family, 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours. And we have 60 days to complete that whole investigation. So gathering all that information up, making sure we meet with everybody in the family, gathering their information, documenting it all, writing a report, and then closing with the family, contacting the collaterals and then closing with the family to give them the picture of what we gathered and then what supports they may be able to use in the end of our engagement with them. So some of the things that on top of the whole investigation process, certainly there are things to consider for the process itself, but a couple of the things that we also do include how to plan for worker safety during interactions in the home. And in fact, DCYF has a core academy that Child Protection, Juvenile Probation and Parole, and our SNU staff all go to that has safety in the workplace kinds of conversations. And one of the trainings is specific around safety during home visits and office visits. And then certainly there is also training for staff around how to incorporate culture in their interactions with families and what kinds of things they need to consider even before going out there. So if a family has a particular cultural norm around who can engage with them in terms of male or female preferences, eye contact, what the practices are in certain religions around engagement with those folks, they're going to look that up hopefully prior to their going out with those families. And or maybe if you have that information, you could share it with the worker in terms of engagement. So we kind of talked about some of the questions that you could ask of a family, but some of the things that DCYF would love to be able to get information from you for is gathering the full picture of a family. Not just their stressors, but really what strengths the family brings to the table and the things that you know from having interaction with them on a regular basis. Because if we can build on the strengths that families already have, then those would be the things that staff can have a conversation with them about. Understanding the best ways to engage families. Again, we just want, we talked about DCYF doesn't want to be involved in these families' lives on a regular and ongoing basis. We want families to be able to keep their kids safe on their own. So if we know really good ways and options to engage with families and you know about them, those are the kinds of things we'd love to know. The thing that we do want to really do is rule out any false information. If there are rumors or neighbors reporting on each other, which sometimes happens, those kinds of things we want to know about. And if you have knowledge of any of that, that would be great to know as well. And then certainly, if you know about any new information, say in the course of an intake, information was already shared, but you maybe know about some new information. So a parent got a job, and some of the financial stress has been relieved from the family. Or if there's a protective order that a parent has taken out on another parent that would change the situation in terms of safety for both the adults and the children in the home, we'd want to know about that as well, because that would certainly guide the conversation a little better. So what about safety? If DCYF is looking at safety, well, if they are looking at safety planning, when they are looking at safety planning, we're talking about the need for a safety plan with a parent and their understanding about what that actually means. And it comes down to the practicality of it. If a parent is, for example, using opioids and they are unable in their addiction of this drug to protect their children, DCYF is going to talk to that parent about who can come in that house and watch this child or take care of this child, or who's already in there that can do that, that is not addicted, that is not causing a safety issue for a child. And again, that's through a whole conversation with lots of people to figure out what can work for this family. And asking their families to come up with that information. Because really we want them to be able to protect their kids. And so, I guess I kind of talked about all of this. So involving the parent when considering the least intrusive means possible. Again, considering a third person coming in. And then if you know this information, again, what kind of triggers are there for parents in terms of our conversation about them? Because we want to know if we're sending them over the edge just by having a conversation with them. We want to know if there are things that we're talking about in the report that are going to trigger them. If there is a history of abuse and neglect that you know about that maybe DCYF doesn't know, either from the parent or the child, maybe they're from out of state and you know something that DCYF doesn't know, that would be good to know as well. Okay, so this big, huge matrix is a lot of what we've already talked about. But I wanted to put it out there because it's a complicated process. And there's overlays to this flow chart that aren't even on here, that involve court processes from the criminal aspect of court and can overflow into any one of these areas. And it's not added here because certainly it's not a DCYF process. But know that this isn't the only thing that's happening possibly in a family's life in terms of abuse or neglect. So we started at the intake process. It can go on to a district office and be investigated, but it can also be screened out because maybe it's not enough information, which we kind of already talked about. But if combined with other folks' reports, so you may be the linchpin to bring more information to the picture that sends it on to a district office, please do that. But those screen outs stay within our agency for 1 year. So again, we refer back to them to see what's there. And if it's all part of the picture, it may be added to that. Once it goes to a district office, again, the child protection worker for investigations is going to look at that or meet with that family and look at danger. Again, we're gathering the whole set of information that I've already talked about. So the supervisor and the CPSW review all the facts and make a determination. And so that you kind of know that this is not done in a vacuum and a child protection worker doesn't do this on their own in terms of making a decision. The conclusion is whether it's unfounded, founded problem resolved, or founded case open. Unfounded is really those ones that we talked about that aren't determined to be abusive or neglectful. Founded problem resolved might be something that, yes, abuse or neglect did occur, but the problem has been resolved and the safety issue has been taken care of, say by a parent who's protecting their child. Another, the one. Okay. Then we move to the founded case open, where the conversation has been had with families and really by virtue of the fact that they just aren't able to keep kids safe, we need to have a further conversation and a further involvement with families to have that happen. There's two ways that DCYF can become involved when a case is founded. There's a non-court case where safety and danger can be resolved with some community agencies becoming involved and with some interventions and regular visits from DCYF. The other one is court cases where we work with families with kids in the home and work with families where kids are needed to be placed. Ooh, we have 3 minutes left. Okay. So walking through that process quickly, out-of-home placements, kids are in care, in DCYF care, so foster care or group care. And the bottom line for that is we talked about permanency. We want them to be with a family. We have 12 months to do that by federal law. So we need to involve services, talk with families. You folks might be a part of that process. You may not. But to work with families to help that situation and get that kid back home as soon as possible. That's the ultimate goal for us. We want the reunification to happen. If it doesn't happen, all along that line, we're talking about a permanency plan. So we're talking with families about, yes, we want this child to go home with you. And if these conditions are met and things are changed so that kids can go home, that's what's going to happen. If they can't be met, and we're talking about this right up front, then what are the options for us? Are the kids going to go stay with a relative, guardianship with them? Are they going to be adopted by a foster parent? This is the reality of the conversation that we have to have with parents around kids that are placed. For in-home cases, again, we may be followed in court and have regular review hearings, but around that, we're talking about the services that are put in that home to alleviate the safety issues, but also to get us out of there so that kids can stay home with their families without us being involved and possibly with community services continuing. Oh, I breezed through that, sorry. I went a little quickly. So if folks have questions about that, I would be very happy to answer. Yeah.
question.
Okay.
Aaron.
Aaron.
Says, I know in my area we have an extreme lack of foster families for children that are removed. What is the state doing about this?
So thank you, Aaron, for your question about there's a severe lack of foster parents in their area to take some kids. I will tell you that that's not just in your area, Aaron. There is a shortage throughout the state. There have been significant efforts in terms of recruitment for foster parents on an ongoing basis. So we've advertised, certainly if anyone has seen the Home at Last segments on WNUR through Chronicle, those highlight kids who are free for adoption, but there's also a little push there to ask those to become foster parents. It's a true shortage, and through local efforts, we have what's called resource workers in each office. Those are child protection workers who specifically look at foster parents. And as a part of that, and in partnership with Granite State College partners who do training through our education and training partnership for foster families, there's advertisement and recruitment through those efforts, and training for those potential foster parents to then become licensed and be able to take kids. Does it help with the extreme shortages in the short term? Not always, and we are always looking for families, and sometimes those kids end up placed farther away from their home than we would like. Those efforts continue, and we do continue to get inquiries about them. Foster parenting is a tough job, and I will tell you that what's been happening more recently is foster parents, we're asking them to do a whole lot more with kids. We're asking them to be those forever families if those kids can't go home to their birth families. So their job is a whole lot harder in terms of they need to parent, love, and care for those kids, but then be prepared to give them back if those parents are able to take their kids back. So it's a tough job in terms of asking them to do something. That said, though, there are tons of people who always want to do that. So that those efforts continue, and that's, I think that part is the most positive. So I would put it out there, too, if any one of you wanted to become a foster parent, we'd be more than happy to have you join our team. So thanks.
Heidi, this is Katie. I know that Heidi Petzold has another question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute her line.
Oh, great.
Hi, Heidi. As I'm looking through this screen, I just wanted to ask that same question before about it can look like a lot of cases go to court when in fact DCYF provides in-home supports to really prevent court from happening, and the majority of cases do not go to court. And even if they do, the majority of those cases, children do stay in the home, and DCYF continues to provide support to reduce the events that child be removed from the home. And I was wondering if you could say that, one, that percent again, and two, what's the statute or the legal law for children being removed for the home? Because I know it's pretty severe. If I can remember, it's likely to suffer serious harm or death. So very small percent of cases, children are actually removed from the home. So I just want to kind of maybe ease some fears that the majority of cases mainly are either unfounded or supports are put in place to reduce court cases.
So, okay, I would concur with most of what you said in terms of the court case piece. And actually what's happened on the flip side in terms of the last 5 years are the numbers in terms of kids going into care have actually dropped significantly around, so for example, we had at one point there was about a 75-25 split of children being served in foster care and kids at home. That split is actually reduced down to a 50-50 split. And when we talk about the numbers in terms of being founded, certainly those numbers are much smaller, and realistically, across the nation, New Hampshire has the lowest number of founded cases, whether they're in placement or not. But the ones that are in placement are much fewer than the ones that overall are not in terms of founded and then founded court opened. Yeah, I'm hoping that answers it. Are you? So I just want to take a second to say thank you to everyone for being able to participate on this webinar, and I hope I've answered your questions. Certainly, if you have continued questions, you're more than welcome to give our intake a call at 1-800-894-5533 or out-of-state 271-6562. And I wish you well in your home visiting endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you everybody for being on today's webinar. Please keep an eye out in your mailbox. We will be sending out an evaluation link later on, and we will also be sending out the webinar link once it's posted online to share with your colleagues who weren't here today. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you.